having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Please be seated. I woke up on the morning of January 6th, 2014, to find the world blanketed in white and more snow falling. There may have been 3 inches of snow, which for that part of Middle Tennessee is cataclysmic. Little did I know just how acquainted I would become with much larger snowfalls and much more significant Epiphany snow. I made my way slowly from my little retreat house where I and the other intern of the convent lived towards the main convent building. Snow continuing to fall and swirl around me. The 3 inches we had already received crunching under my feet. I walked in the main door to find Sister Elizabeth rushing up and down the walkway between the main building and the chapel, carrying communion bread and the cruet full of wine with her. Our priest won't be able to make it today, she said. Can't get out of his driveway. So we're going to have service in the dining room. I stepped through the threshold into the large dining room with its giant window facing south off the edge of the Cumberland Plateau and over the valley dropping some 900 feet below. To see snow swirling all around, the sky gray. It was this incredible winter scene. So the small group of us, the 5 sisters, the community's other intern, myself, a dog and a cat curled up on the floor, we gathered around the table and took our seats. And I soon realized why we were having our service at the dining table and not in the chapel. It wasn't just the inadequate heating system in that chapel, but it was because Sister Lucy was going to be our celebrant. Sister Lucy was born a few miles south of the convent in that very same valley that we could see out the window. She had been a sister in that order, in the Order of St. Mary, for more than 50 years. She was the first woman ordained in the state of Tennessee in the Episcopal Church in order to serve as a priest to that community, as well as one of the sisters. She had lived a remarkable life. By the time that I arrived at the convent and lived alongside the sisters, she was in poor health. She relied on a wheelchair to make it back and forth to the chapel, and she struggled to see. Her health only worsened during my year there. We took our places for the service, and Lucy began officiating. But because of her diminished eyesight, she no longer officiated in the chapel, no longer functioned as a priest in the same way. But there in that dining room, sitting around that table, she recited the familiar prayers, the familiar words from memory. It was as if they emerged from deep within her, words that had been written on her heart, more spoken through her than by her. As she continued, Sister Lucy raised the consecrated bread off the plate and broke it. Snow still swirling outside the window. Alleluia. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. Alleluia. A cold coming we had of it. Just the worst time of year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. It is with those words that T.S. Eliot begins his Journey of the Magi poem, which is his meditation on these wise men from the East, bearing their gifts for the Christ child in the manger. In that poem, he conjures an image of weary travelers, buffeted by snow as they traverse mountain passes, seeking the very spot where the star was guiding them, the place where the prophets had claimed that a king would arise over Jerusalem, over Israel from. In this Epiphany story, we are not told why these wise men from the east left their homes to make their way to Israel. Sure, there was a star appearing in the east, and they had a vague memory of a prophecy, but that hardly seems a reason to undertake what would have been a perilous and demanding journey. And for what? What did they expect to find when they arrived? What did the birth of a king mean to them? I can't help but think that they followed that star because of a pull that was beyond them. They chose to follow, but the urge to do so was beyond them, outside of them. It compelled them. They left their homes because it was necessary. If they hadn't, they would have been left wondering all their lives, what was there beneath that star? Perhaps they knew what they were getting into. But my guess is that, like most journeys, the destination that they thought they were going to was almost certainly not what unfolded. They expected to find the king the star proclaimed in the palace in Jerusalem or in the temple, in a place of prominence, heralded by all the people. But that's not what happened. When they arrived in Jerusalem, Herod gathered the scribes and the priests to try to puzzle out what this sign could mean. And those wise men from the east were led out from Jerusalem to a small, unremarkable town, to a small, unremarkable house, or perhaps the manger itself. And inside they found a young mother and her uncertain husband, and a baby laying there, or in its mother's arms. This is where they had been led. They knelt before the child and laid out their gifts, a gesture of care and respect. This may not have been the thing that they expected. They trusted in the star that had guided them. In another act of faith, they hear a voice in their dreams, warning them not to go back to Herod, and so they don't. Instead, we hear that they return to their homes by another road. The story of these wise men from the east, who are probably from Persia or somewhere in that area of the world, is a story of an encounter. After the shepherds who first go to the manger, these magi, these wise men, are the first group of people who encounter the baby Jesus, who encounter the Christ child, the child who it was proclaimed would save his people. And though they may not be able to describe it fully, something happens in that encounter. They are overwhelmed by the joy of it and offer their finest gifts to the newborn baby. Then they go home by another road. As T.S. Eliot puts it in his poem, in that journey home, they are no longer at ease in the old dispensation. From that encounter with Christ, everything is changed. They return home and carry his light with them. They are transformed in some way by it, in such a way that there is no simply going back to the way things were. Over that year in the convent, I watched how the sisters, 5 women whose lives were bound together not by blood or choice, but a shared calling to a life in community. I watched how they cared for one another, particularly Lucy. They certainly did not always get along. I could occasionally sense tensions in the community. Like any of us who have ever had to live with another human being, There are inevitably conflicts that arise over what's going to be for dinner and who's going to do the laundry, who's reading in chapel that day, who was singing off key during the psalm. It was usually me, but they had a lot of grace. They had different visions of the direction and future of their order. But despite all of these challenges that come with living together, when it mattered most, I witnessed how they loved one another in profound ways, how they cared for one another. Sister Lucy broke the bread into pieces for us and passed the plate around. Each person looked the next in the eyes and said, "The body of Christ and the bread of heaven, the blood of Christ and the cup of salvation." Each time we receive the Eucharist, it is an encounter with Christ. It is as if we are there with the wise men kneeling before the baby Jesus, offering our gifts and receiving something so much greater in return. But I found that there are times when that encounter with Christ feels especially present, especially poignant. When Christ's presence in the bread and wine are unmistakable, when I have no doubt that he is truly there. And there on that snowy Epiphany, with sheets of white still coming down outside, with Sister Lucy reciting those words that were written in her heart, he was there. And the love between the sisters and their warm welcome to me and all who came through those doors, he was there. In his letter to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul, or someone writing in his name, reflects on his own epiphany. The mystery made known to me by revelation. After his own encounter with Christ, everything is changed. His whole life shifts in a new direction as a result of that promise of salvation and abundant life. And in his writing to the Ephesians, Paul shares how he's come to realize that that promise of salvation is no longer just for the people of Israel. The profound change, the thing that will never go back to the way it was because of Christ, is that all have been welcomed as part of God's family. That promise of salvation and abundant life, once promised to Abraham and his descendants, is now open to everyone. Through Christ, God is drawing all people to God's self, making all the people of the earth one body. Through the encounter with Christ, through experiencing him and his transformative love, the whole world is being made new. New possibilities open up as God's love spreads throughout this world, like the sunrise illuminating a shaded valley, first touching the mountaintops and then filling the whole space. The change that begins with the birth of Jesus in the manger may not always be obvious. The external details of our lives may remain the same. We'll walk out of this church today, and snow will still likely be falling, and war will still rage in the Ukraine and in Gaza, and the dread of another election cycle will hang in the air. But that's where faith comes in. The faith to believe in the transformative power of God's love, even when we don't see its effects. And it all begins with the encounter. Encountering God here, present in bread and wine, transformed into body and blood. Encountering Christ present in the loving care of members of community, in a meal offered or a kind word, a gesture, an act of help when it's desperately needed. That Eucharist, sitting around that dining table with snow falling outside, would be the final time that Sister Lucy would preside over communion before she died later that year. She died in the convent in the place that had been her home for more than 50 years, with her sisters around her, having cared for her till the very end. I encountered Christ on that snowy Epiphany, and I carry that encounter with me. It's one of those moments that has sustained my faith, that has taught me more of who God is and challenged me to share the love that I witnessed and experienced in that community. The question that I have for all of us on this Epiphany is this: where have you encountered Christ? And how has that encounter changed you? How is God calling you to respond to the love that you have experienced in your life? And how is God calling you to share that light with the world?